So our last topic we have to cover in this lecture is going to be neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are those chemical messengers that are released from the axon terminal of a presynaptic neuron, and they're going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to the postsynaptic neuron in order to elicit a graded potential on that postsynaptic neuron. So neurotransmitters are those chemical messengers that are released from the presynaptic neuron that are trying to cause a graded potential on that postsynaptic neuron. Neurotransmitters could be excitatory, inhibitory, or either, depending on the tissue. So if a neurotransmitter is excitatory, it's bringing that postsynaptic neuron closer to threshold, so that postsynaptic neuron is being depolarized. If that neurotransmitter is inhibitory, it's bringing that postsynaptic neuron farther away from threshold. And so in other words, that postsynaptic neuron is being hyperpolarized. So excitatory, we're potentially getting closer to threshold and eliciting an action potential. Inhibitory, we're going farther away from threshold in order to prevent an action potential on that postsynaptic neuron. Neurotransmitters are clinically important, so we're going to talk about a number of instances where both therapeutic drugs to treat certain diseases or disorders are mimicking neurotransmitters, or we're also going to talk about neurotransmitters and how they actually are mimicked by certain recreational drugs. So we're going to talk about a number of clinically important neurotransmitters and how they relate to certain diseases, disorders, and recreational drugs. There are a ton of different neurotransmitters. So there are actually more than 50 different types of neurotransmitters. We're obviously not going to go through all 50 of our neurotransmitters, but there is a table in your textbook that's going to break down neurotransmitters into different groups or classes. So I'm going to cover some of our different neurotransmitters, or I guess just a small subset. So we're going to start with a neurotransmitter that should be very familiar to you, and that's going to be acetylcholine. So in this slide here, this is showing you that table from your textbook. There's a lot of information in that table from your textbook. I only want you to know the information that I'm telling you about each individual neurotransmitter. So I might talk about the classification of the neurotransmitter, so if it acts directly or indirectly, if it's excitatory or inhibitory, where it's located, and what it does. But I only want you to know what I'm telling you about these different neurotransmitters. You don't need to know everything that's presented in this table from your textbook. So you're already familiar with acetylcholine. You have seen acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. So it's going to be released from a somatic motor neuron, and it's going to cause an action potential on a skeletal muscle fiber. So acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter present at the neuromuscular junction. That's going to be a part of our somatic motor or our somatic nervous system or our voluntary nervous system. Acetylcholine is also going to be released at synapses in the autonomic nervous system, which is our involuntary nervous system. So remember, somatic nervous system is controlling voluntary movements. Our autonomic nervous system is controlling involuntary movements. Acetylcholine is also going to be present in our central nervous system. So it's going to be a neurotransmitter that's released at neuronal synapses in the brain and the spinal cord. So it's located at the neuromuscular junction, which is a part of our somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the central nervous system. We can classify neurotransmitters based on their mechanism of action, so if they act directly or indirectly, and we can also classify them as excitatory or inhibitory. So acetylcholine has direct or indirect actions. We're going to talk a little more about the mechanisms of actions a little bit later. But for right now, I want you to know that a direct mechanism of action means that acetylcholine is diffusing across that synaptic cleft and binding directly to its receptor on that postsynaptic membrane in order to cause that graded potential. So acetylcholine is acting directly by binding to its receptor on that postsynaptic membrane. Indirect action means that acetylcholine is going to act through a secondary messenger, and then that secondary messenger is going to diffuse across and bind to the postsynaptic membrane, causing a graded potential. So direct action, acetylcholine itself is diffusing across and binding, causing that graded potential. Indirect action, acetylcholine uses a secondary messenger in order to cause that graded potential on the postsynaptic membrane. So acetylcholine can act directly or indirectly. Acetylcholine can also be excitatory or inhibitory. So at the neuromuscular junction and in the central nervous system, acetylcholine is excitatory. So it's trying to bring that postsynaptic membrane closer to threshold so that an action potential can be generated. In the autonomic nervous system, acetylcholine can be excitatory or inhibitory. So this depends on the tissue at which acetylcholine is acting. So acetylcholine in the autonomic nervous system could be excitatory or inhibitory. It's just going to be dependent on the tissue at which that neurotransmitter is acting. Acetylcholine is also clinically important. So we know that the levels of acetylcholine in certain areas of the brain are going to be decreased in patients with Alzheimer's. So patients with Alzheimer's have reduced levels of acetylcholine at certain regions of their brain. So what they've done in order to counteract some of these reduced levels of acetylcholine is to try to increase the levels of acetylcholine by preventing acetylcholine's removal from the synaptic cleft. So one way that they've done that is by creating essentially a molecule that's going to come in and block acetylcholinesterase. Remember that acetylcholinesterase is that enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft. And so what this drug does is it comes in and it blocks acetylcholinesterase. So it's actually preventing the breakdown of acetylcholine from that synaptic cleft. So therefore, we're actually increasing the amount of acetylcholine released at a synapse in an effort to counteract some of the reduced levels of acetylcholine in Alzheimer's. Another group of neurotransmitters that I want to focus on are biogenic amines. In general, biogenic amines are referred to as some of our feel-good neurotransmitters. In other words, they're neurotransmitters that are released at neural synapses that regulate emotional behavior. So they're neurotransmitters that are released in neural pathways that regulate emotional behavior. So there are two biogenic amines I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on norepinephrine, and I'm going to focus on dopamine. Once again, you do not need to know all of the information presented in these tables. You just need to know the information that I'm presenting to you about each individual neurotransmitter. So first, biogenic amines in general tend to act indirectly. So they tend to act through that secondary messenger system. So that neurotransmitter is released. It then goes through a secondary messenger in order to produce a graded potential on that postsynaptic neuron. That postsynaptic potential could be excitatory or inhibitory, just depends on the tissue, and it also depends on the neurotransmitter. So norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that's going to be located in two different places. First, norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that's going to be released from motor neurons in the autonomic nervous system, or our involuntary nervous system. So norepinephrine is going to be a neurotransmitter that helps to regulate our involuntary movements. Norepinephrine is also located in our central nervous system, where it's released in neural pathways that regulate emotional behavior. So this is where that neurotransmitter acts as our feel-good neurotransmitter. So it's helping to regulate our emotions. Certain drugs are going to impact norepinephrine's effects. So amphetamines actually increase the release of norepinephrine in the central nervous system. So therefore, it's going to create that kind of high off of amphetamines. Cocaine is going to also create that high, but it's going to do so in a different way by actually blocking the removal of norepinephrine from the synapse. So both amphetamines and cocaine are going to create this kind of feel-good high. Amphetamines do so by increasing the release of norepinephrine at a synapse, so there's going to be more neurotransmitter. Cocaine is actually going to block the removal of that neurotransmitter from the synapse. Dopamine is another biogenic amine. Dopamine also is a feel-good neurotransmitter in our central nervous system. So again, it's a neurotransmitter that's going to be released in neural pathways that are regulating emotional behavior. Dopamine is clinically important because we have found that in Parkinson's disease, those patients have too little dopamine released at synapses in the central nervous system. In schizophrenia, we see that we have too much dopamine released at synapses. So it's a clinically relevant neurotransmitter because two different diseases are associated with either an increase or a decrease in dopamine release in the synapses in our central nervous system. So Parkinson's is associated with too little dopamine. Schizophrenia is going to be associated with too much dopamine or overactive dopamine secretion. Another group of neurotransmitters are amino acids. So certain amino acids can also act as neurotransmitters, so they can be released from neurons in order to produce graded potentials on postsynaptic neurons. So there's 3 different amino acids that we're going to focus on. We're not going to go into a ton of information about amino acids as neurotransmitters. The first one's called GABA. GABA is also known as gamma aminobutyric acid. This is a specialized amino acid, or I guess you could say a modified amino acid. We also have glutamate, or glutamic acid, and then we have glycine. So GABA is going to be a widespread inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. Glutamate is going to be one of our major excitatory neurotransmitters in the brain. And then glycine is going to be a major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord. So we're going to see that amino acids are going to be some of our major neurotransmitters in the central nervous system. So when we get to the brain and the spinal cord, or our central nervous system, we're going to see that amino acids are going to play a major role in regulating those neural pathways. One interesting thing about glutamate is that glutamate is also known as our ischemic stroke neurotransmitter. And that occurs because in a ischemic stroke, there's excessive release of glutamate at the synapse. Excessive release of glutamate at the synapse between 2 neurons can actually cause excitotoxicity in that postsynaptic neuron. So all that means is that the neurons are literally being stimulated to death. So too much glutamate released at that synapse leads to neuronal death in that postsynaptic neuron. So that can be caused by, or that can then lead to sensory motor function deficits. It can lead to changes in speech, changes in vision. So depending on which area of the brain is damaged in an ischemic stroke, or which area of the brain has neurons dying in response to excess glutamate release, that's going to have different outcomes to that stroke. So that's why some people after a stroke maybe can't speak as well. Some people have changes in their sensory motor functions and so on. So glutamate is also known as our ischemic stroke neurotransmitter because it's going to be released in excess during an ischemic stroke, and it's going to cause excitotoxicity and therefore neuronal death. Certain peptides can also act as neurotransmitters. So we're going to focus on just a couple of peptides. We're going to focus on our endorphins and enkephalins and cholecystokinin. So peptides can also act as neurotransmitters. Endorphins and enkephalins are two peptides that act indirectly or using secondary messengers. They're typically inhibitory, and they're acting as endogenous opiates in order to block pain. So these are endogenous opiates that are functioning to block pain. So endorphins are going to release during exercise in order to block any pain associated with exercise. That's also known as the runner's high. Endorphins or enkephalins are then going to be released during childbirth, and they're going to act as kind of a natural painkiller during childbirth by blocking pain. So they're inhibiting some of those pain pathways. These endogenous opiates are actually going to be mimicked by heroin and morphine. So both heroin and morphine are going to act as endogenous opiates in order to block pain. Another peptide that can act as a neurotransmitter is cholecystokinin, or CCK. We're going to talk about cholecystokinin when we get to the digestive system, but I just thought it was interesting. This is actually a hormone in the digestive system, CCK, but it can actually also function as a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system and in the small intestine. So this is a peptide that can function as both a hormone in the digestive system as well as a neurotransmitter in the digestive system and in the central nervous system, so in the brain and the spinal cord. Purines are another group of neurotransmitters. So there's going to be two purines that can act as neurotransmitters. We have ATP and we have adenosine. So purines, remember, are some of our nitrogen-containing bases in DNA and RNA. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is going to be a neurotransmitter that can act directly or indirectly. It could be excitatory or inhibitory. ATP is not only our universal form of energy, but it's also one of our major neurotransmitters in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So ATP we've talked about a ton just as that kind of universal form of energy. I just also wanted to point out that ATP is also going to play a major role as a neurotransmitter, so a chemical messenger in our neural pathways in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So it just goes to show how important ATP is in our bodies. Another purine is adenosine. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter that can act indirectly, so again, through that secondary messenger system. It is a potent inhibitor in the brain, so it has inhibitory functions. And what caffeine does is caffeine actually comes in and blocks these adenosine receptors in order to prevent us from feeling tired. So normally these adenosines released when we're tired, right? And so it's going to be released in increasing amounts throughout the day. It's going to be stimulating that feeling of tiredness or fatigue. What caffeine does is caffeine actually comes in and it blocks those adenosine receptors. So even though we might have increasing adenosine being released over the course of the day, the adenosine can't actually bind to its receptors and therefore inhibit, and therefore it allows for that action potential to occur in that postsynaptic neuron. So adenosine is an indirect neurotransmitter. It's inhibitory, and caffeine actually blocks our adenosine receptors in order to prevent us from feeling tired. Our last group of neurotransmitters are going to be gases and lipids. So I don't want to go into too much information on our gases and lipids, but two gases that could act as neurotransmitters are nitric oxide, or NO, and carbon monoxide. And then an important lipid that can act as a neurotransmitter is endocannabinoids. So endocannabinoids are neurotransmitters that are released in neural pathways that regulate appetite, memory, nausea, and vomiting. And endocannabinoids are actually mimicked by THC. So THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana, is actually going to bind to endocannabinoid receptors in order to also then cause changes in appetite, memory, nausea, and vomiting.